Hey everyone, welcome back to Reading with Tatiana. Today I'm doing my book review on Sex Cult Nun, Breaking Away from the Children of God, a wild radical religious cult by Faith Jones. And I gave this book a 4 out of 5. It is definitely worth a read. Before I start my full review, I would like to do my Booktuber Shoutout, which I've added to every part of my video, because if we can lift each other up in a Booktuber community, why not? You might find a channel that resonates with you that you wouldn't find otherwise, so I just thought it'd be worth sharing. So my Booktuber Shoutout today is actually a booktube, which is actually not about book reviews, but about reading with me. So I actually came across this type of YouTube or booktube community before I started my channel, where people would post themselves reading, and then I was like, I read all the time, like why don't I film myself and also try to make a YouTube out of it. I do find that it was really hard to sustain because even though I do read every day, it's hard to find the right framing or find the right music and lighting and that kind of stuff. So I did not continue doing the read with me, which you can find in earlier in my channel. But this channel was the first channel that inspired me to start my booktube with read with me segments, but now I have obviously progressed to full book reviews. So the Booktuber show I want to do is Read with Kate. I will pop her YouTube channel down below, and she fully does read with me's. They go from 10 minutes to an hour. She also does reading challenges where she'll post every day and will challenge you to read with her. And she's also from the West Coast, so I really love her backgrounds. It makes me feel very homesick as I've moved now to the middle of Canada. Well, still West, but not West Coast. So yeah, if you want to check out Read with Kate, her channel will be linked down below. As always, before I get into my full book review, I would appreciate if you can hit the subscribe button, if you can give this video a thumbs up, and if you've read this book yourself, Sex Cult Nun, I would appreciate to hear your comments and your thoughts about it. And if you have any recommendations for me to read or feedback on my channel or review style, I would deeply appreciate it. So before I go into my full review, I like to talk about the year this book was published and also the genre. The book was published just last year in 2021, so it's very recent. And the genre of this book is a memoir, nonfiction. Faith Jones is the author, and I'll talk more a bit about her. Faith Jones is the author of this book. It's a memoir, or I will even say biography of her life. She is born to 2 American parents. However, she was raised in Macau. She was born in the cult, Children of God. She was raised by the cult, and then ultimately she did leave and was, I think they use the word reprogramming or deprogramming back into society. During her time in this cult, she did several missionaries in several countries. As I said, Macau was a big one, China, Taiwan, Russia, Japan, and Kazakhstan. And the reason why she moved around so much is part of this cult is they spread the word of God and do it via missionaries around the world to contribute to local society and to also take from local societies as well in form of donations. The Children of God cult normally only believes in education not past grade school. They believe that their kids should be able to read, do basic math, and that kind of stuff for day-to-day living, but they didn't really push for learning after that or higher education. Faith Jones, she actually left the cult in her early 20s, 23 to be exact, and she was fortunate enough that in her experience, she was able to push and self-educate for her high school diploma. She got to eventually go to university, got her law degree, and she is now has her own law practice and legal education business. So it's very inspiring to see what she did considering the circumstances that she was born and raised into. Even though the cult had lots of abusive and trauma for Faith Jones, fortunately with all her international work and exposure to people from different countries, I think it really helped with her gaining success in her current career as a consultant in law and businesses and entrepreneurs. And because of her missionary work, she also became fluent in Mandarin, which I think also helped develop her career in law as well, right when she graduated. Faith Jones is also a inspirational speaker, so you can actually find her TED Talks on YouTube, and she also does leadership courses and that kind of stuff for people, for women especially, who have dealt with trauma or childhood abuse. So now I'll get into more about the book and the characters. Normally I do my reviews and kind of do like different segments for the story and the characters and the plot. But in this case, because it's a memoir and a biography, I would kind of talk about my experience of the book to give you an introduction to it. And it will kind of go all over the place because it's all intermingled. One thing I found really interesting about reading this memoir and biography is that if you choose to read this yourself, that you can also find a bunch of documentaries on YouTube to learn more about the start of the cult. So I'm just doing a very high level introduction of the cult because I feel like it's worth reading and researching yourself. Having said that though, there is a history section at the beginning of the book which covers how the cult started. But I do feel like it's from Faith Jones's point of view. So I think it's very beneficial to watch a bunch of documentaries on YouTube to get like a well-rounded picture of the cult. So from what I understand from the cult and how it started was Faith Jones, who is actually the granddaughter of the founder of the cult. He was part of these churches in America when he was younger. And he, I think, became a pastor or a priest for this church that was very multi-ethnic, lots of ethnicities, and there was a disparity between wealth within the members of the church. So he really believed that people who are more well off should help people who are less well off, which seemed very idealistic and it makes sense, right? But in the real world, like, people don't want to do that, and it kind of rejected his idea of Christian communism. So he was motivated to start his own church under a Christian non-denomination, and then that's how the cult started. So it just was really cool or interesting to hear that, because it shows that, not all cults are evil to start with or have a bad intention, and his intention was purely that he wanted more equality in the church. So that's how it started. However, as we progress through the memoir and the biography, we learn that he uses power and uses the guise of equality for women and children to make it seem like it's equal, but it's really just women and children sacrificing their comfort and their consent for the higher power of God. So it's kind of twisted, and eventually throughout the book you quickly learn that there's lots of children molestation, lots of women coerced to sleep in with multiple partners, and it's just like really awful. But I find it interesting how, when it started, it was very innocent and very idealistic and doesn't sound that bad. And I guess that's how all cults start, and that's how they attract members. And that was just really interesting for me to learn how this cult started. The book also mentioned that the grandfather was so successful in recruiting people because he felt he was shunned from society with his beliefs that didn't really go with society. So he would recruit people who also felt shunned, who maybe believe in God or a form of Christian values, but maybe didn't totally agree with their church. He would also recruit people who were homeless. And I think there was a segment where he also recruited people who were surfers in California at the time, people who were against the US having war in Vietnam or Korea, and he kind of took advantage of that and just recruiting people who also were shunned by society and be like, hey, we can make our own society where our beliefs and our values are heard and we can create it. So I think that was very smart in terms of creating a cult and recruiting members. The book really covers Faith Jones' life from before she was born, with how the cult started, to how her parents met, to how she was born. And we follow Faith Jones' life basically all up until the way she leaves the cult. And I really enjoyed the story because a lot of times, it's awful what happened to her, but it's also so great that we can hear these stories. And she gives a platform for people who've also been abused to also be like, hey, I'm not alone, that has suffered. And because Faith has been able to share her trauma and her abuse, that lets them also share their abuse. And I believe there's other members of this cult, Children of God, who've also written books or have interviews about their experience. So it was kind of cool because I feel a lot of times with cults, things are a mystery, I don't know what's happening, but for this cult, it's a tell-all. So she gets into all the nitty-gritty details. And because it's from her point of view, it's not a factual textbook. So a lot of times she'll describe something she experienced, and from her perspective, it was just what she was experiencing at the time, and there was no malicious or bad intent. But as a reader reading it, I can definitely tell oh, that's not great, and that man or that adult is really treating her inappropriately. But for her, you get to really see the lens of what's it like being a cult, and you're brainwashed to be accepting and to be pleasing and to be loyal to God, and you don't really question those things. So I really thought that aspect of the book was super interesting. Other things in the book I want to mention in terms of the plot and the story is that the cult was very good at othering everyone else that was in the cult. So they'll call everyone that was part of like regular society to be a systemite. You didn't want to be part of the system if you're in this cult. So they always try to exclude themselves or separate themselves from people who are part of the system, which I think was a very smart tactic if you were to start or join a cult, to other yourself from the rest of the world and society. I apologize because I do feel like this review is all over the place, but it was just a lot to take in. There's so much information. This book is like pretty hardy. It's just under 400 pages, but like I couldn't put it down, and every time I read it, I just had to read it in like sections. So sorry that this review is all over the place. I'm just giving my natural reaction to it. There are so many lessons learned and common themes in this book, but I just want to touch on the few that resonate with me. Things I don't want to get into because it's not really that something I really want to talk about or get into, but a common theme obviously through the book is abuse and trauma, which I think Faith Jones does a really good job talking about, especially at the end when she leaves a cult and she's able to see and identify the trauma she went through her whole life. But when she was in it, she obviously wasn't able to see that. One thing I really enjoyed the book, especially when Faith Jones had left the cult, and her going to university, is her always just questioning what she's learned, and you always challenge things she's learned and not just accept it at face value, because that's what she did her whole life when she's in the cult. So one thing I want to quote from the book is, the only way to logically determine anything is to be open to the idea, that possibility that none of it is. If it's true, you don't have to protect it. Questioning it deeply only reveals more and strengthens it. So I really like that quote because it's kind of saying like, if something is actually true and honest, if you question it, then it'll just be revealed that it's more true and that it's more strengthened, right? And if it is true, then people don't need to protect it because the truth shouldn't be malicious. It shouldn't stop you from anything. So I really like the idea of that, even for me, who's not religious or grew up in a cult, obviously, and now that I'm an adult, is to always question things and always be curious and always ask what if or why. So it's something that I really learned from the book. And there's so many things, like I feel in my 20s, just like I went through a phase where I questioned the way I was raised, not because I had bad experience, but because that's what I knew. But does that mean that I have to continue the cycle? And the answer is no, right? In addition to what I said earlier about the general theme about trauma and abuse, is this book really shares how cults or even religions, to some extent, depending on religion, is able to use the idea of guilt to really get people to band together and for people to believe in the cause. And that was so interesting to me, to see what the power of guilt can do, because not only in the book was she guilted by members of her cult, Children of God, but she was so guilty and it was so ingrained in her to not do these things that when she did something bad and there was no witness to it, she felt so guilty that she admitted to what she was doing to the cult. And she didn't have to do that. Other common themes I found in the book was the idea of consent and what it means to be a consenting human, whether you're a child or an adult. And one thing that the book talked about is, as a child, like, you cannot give consent even if you're a very mature or developed child, because as a child you are conditioned to want to please an adult, whether it's your parent or someone in your life. So this book argues that consent is not possible as a child, which I definitely agree with. And it's very easy to groom and manipulate children as well, because they just want to please whoever is around them. The last common theme I want to talk about very briefly is the possibility of breaking the cycle of abuse. Faith Jones was very empathetic towards her father, who had a history of being abused and abusing his children, but towards the end she kind of understood and see that it is possible to break the abuse. I know not everyone has to continue the cycle, so I thought that was a very interesting theme that the book touched on. Things that I did not enjoy about this book. To be honest, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a 4 out of 5. The reason why I didn't give it a 5 out of 5 for me personally was it didn't have very readability rereading ability. And also I feel like it is an important book to read, but it wasn't a book where I felt like it needs to be in high school curriculum. So I guess the reasons why I didn't like it, but it has nothing to do against Faith Jones or her story, is that a lot of the things that she shares is just really hard to read, and it has nothing to do with her writing style. But as a reader, it was just so hard to be hit with over and over again all the awful things that she and other members of the family went through. And I know that saying that is just very privileged of me because this is her reality. But those are things I didn't like about the book. Just I think if you're interested in reading this book, if you get triggered easily by these things, maybe it's not for you, or read it knowing that it is going to be a heavy read. The other thing I didn't quite like is because the book is told from Faith Jones' point of view. It starts when she was really young, like 4 and 5 years old. Some of her stories, it's kind of really unbelievable how they're so accurate in detail. I don't want to question her experience or her feelings, obviously, because those are true. But as a reader, it was hard to really believe those stories happening to her when she was so young. So it was hard for me to suspend my belief when I was reading the younger parts of her life, and that's something that I didn't quite enjoy. And I know for lots of people on Goodreads, which will be my next section of this video, that was also hard for them to get into the first 30% of the book. Things that I did enjoy about this book is, I think it's a really important story. It's worth reading just to hear about someone's experience who was born into a cult, raised into a cult, and was able to successfully leave it and have a very successful career and place in society, and also breaking the cycle and also helping other people who have been suffering through trauma. So I really like that aspect of Faith Jones' story, because in the book you'll see that lots of people also left the cult but unsuccessfully, either taking their life or causing harm to others or becoming addicts, which is unfortunately a harsh reality of what happens when you're raised in a cult and it's hard for you to adjust back into regular society. One thing I really enjoyed the book, because as it's told from Faith Jones's perspective, is that even though I'm personally not religious, I really do appreciate all the religious affirmations that happen and were sprinkled constantly throughout the book. So one quote I want to share, Faith Jones said, "If you trust God, you don't need to see the whole path, just the next step." And I really like that quote because it just shows that you don't have to know the end goal or the bigger picture. You don't even know if you succeed or not. All you can do is focus on the now and what you can control, which is the immediate future. So I really like that throughout the book. It's almost like a self-help book because Faith Jones affirms with herself her actions, her beliefs to guide her through life. So I really enjoyed that. To add to affirmations, this book also really instilled the idea of discipline, which I really enjoyed. So one quote I want to share when Faith Jones was going through a hard time is that it's going that last step. When you're already exhausted, that makes a difference. So that really reminds me of how, in life, when you're going towards a goal or working towards a objective that's really difficult, when you feel like you've done it all and you can't do any more, it's the mental grit to push it a bit farther that makes you succeed. So I really enjoyed this book, and as I said earlier, it's kind of like a self-help book in many ways. On Goodreads, this book got an average of 3.86 out of 5, which I definitely agree with. I think it's a book that you definitely have to read to get this first-hand experience of someone's story in a cult. But there were some things that were lacking, which I already shared before. So some things that people were saying that they didn't enjoy was that it was hard to see the gap between Faith Jones presently describing the story and then the abuse happening to her, and how when she was describing it as a child, it wasn't that bad, but later on as a reader reading it, we can see it's so awful. So it's hard to believe how she couldn't see that, but I feel like because it's told from her perspective as a child, of course she wouldn't know that it was abuse. And in the book, Faith Jones does say that she didn't feel right, or it felt like uncomfortable, and she would actively avoid adults. So I feel like that review is kind of unjust, because it's told from her perspective. So I feel like when you read these kind of books, you really have to suspend fact from fiction, and you just really have to believe what this person is sharing about their perspective of life. The other thing that people didn't like about this book is the title of the book. So the title I shared earlier is Sex Cult Nun. They felt it was very attention grabby because yes, she is in the cult, and yes, there is sex, but she definitely wasn't a nun. And the book itself is already interesting enough. They don't need a title grab like that. So people, I think, when they picked this book with the title in mind and went into it, it kind of set a bar high for something, and it went down, and then it lowered their expectations. So I think if you go in and not focus on the title of the book, it shouldn't matter. But if you think it's going to be about a nun who does sex and all those kind of crazy things, then you're going to be disappointed. So I can agree with those bad reviews on the title. There were lots of 5 out of 5 reviews on Goodreads, and a lot of them praised Faith Jones for sharing her story, being so vulnerable, being so honest, and just going into very detail about all these experiences and abuses that she went through, as it gives a platform for others who also suffer through trauma to also share their voice and feel validated. And you know, people really like seeing the story of her successfully being deprogrammed by this cult. So people praise her, praise the story, and you know, I agree, it's worth reading. Why I think you should read this book: I think you should read it if you're into cults, if you want to learn more about what it's like to be in cult from a first-hand experience. I also think you should read it if you want to learn to understand and empathize with people who do fall into cults, because I think for an everyday person in society like me, I'm like, it's so easy to avoid it, but I don't think anyone really intentionally chooses to be I guess brainwashed to join a cult and to like isolate from their family and friends. I think it can happen slowly over time, or as I mentioned earlier, they prey on people who are vulnerable, people who are looking to belong. So I feel this book really shows that anyone from any background can become a victim of cult and abusive behavior. So I think this book is worth reading if you want to challenge your views or preconceived notions of being in a cult. Now I'll share how this book made me feel, because as you know, in all my videos, if you ask me in a week, in a month, a year, or 5 years from now, I won't remember the names or what happened in the book exactly, but I'll always remember how a book made me feel. So this book, Sex Cult Nun by Faith Jones, it made me feel horrified. Just horrified by how these things can happen. Not just have happened, but currently still happen in our society, in developed countries, in developing countries, and it's happening all around us all the time. And it's just so sad to think how so many children are born into a life without the freedom that I had, and these women who feel coerced to not have consent for their own bodily autonomy. And it's not just children and women who suffer, there's men who were born into the cycle and also conditioned to perpetuate the abuse. And it just makes me sad that these people don't have that freedom in life that I or you have had. And so yeah, this book made me feel horrible for, I guess, the reality of our societies that maybe we won't see every day, but they definitely do exist in our society. So that's my book review for Sex Cult Nun, Breaking Away from the Children of God, a Wild Radical Religious Cult by Faith Jones. If you read this book, I would love to hear what you thought below. And if you want to join me for my next book, I am reading a classical book that I should have read in high school, but for whatever reason, my teachers never recommended it. I'm reading William Golding's Lord of the Flies. So I'm super excited to read this because I know the premise of it, but I never actually read it. So it should be a good read. If you want to follow along, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.